It began with a quiet message sliding across a polished desk in Ottawa. A confidential note from Beijing proposing what insiders dubbed the Golden Deal. The terms were disarmingly simple: lift Canada's 100% tariff on Chinese EVs, and China would erase every tariff on Canadian agriculture, from canola to pork and seafood, potentially unfreezing nearly $5 billion in exports within weeks. On paper, it read like a lifeline to the prairies, where Saskatchewan and Manitoba had watched silos overflow and processors idle since retaliation measures hit. In practice, it was a geopolitical stress test, forcing Prime Minister Mark Carney to weigh two competing realities: protect Ontario's auto corridor from a wave of low-cost Chinese EVs, or revive the West's agricultural engine by reopening the world's second-largest food market. The stakes for American viewers are immediate. If Canada takes the deal, U.S. Farmers, already losing ground as Brazil captures China's oilseed demand, face a permanent reshuffling of global food flows. If Ottawa refuses, the North American alliance looks intact. But the prairies sink deeper into subsidy-driven stagnation while U.S. tariffs continue to boomerang through integrated supply chains. The headline will say, "Canada accepts China's offer, the U.S. is shocked," but the deeper story is structural. This is about who controls supply routes, who absorbs policy shocks, and who still has the flexibility to set terms in a fractured, post-globalization economy. The question isn't, did Canada betray Washington? It's, can a middle power defend its prosperity without asking permission? Because when food security, clean tech manufacturing, and bloc discipline collide, the winner is not the loudest capital, it's the system that can pivot quickly and credibly under pressure. To understand how Canada's decision sent shockwaves through the continent, we need to rewind to the chain of events that made the Golden Deal inevitable, and see how loyalty to Washington quietly turned into economic self-harm. It started in early 2025, when President Trump, during his second term, announced a sweeping set of 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, vowing to protect American industry from unfair competition. Within hours, Washington's trade office began calling allies, and Ottawa was at the top of that list. The U.S. message was clear: if you want to stay part of North America's unified supply chain, you'll match our tariffs. Canada complied almost overnight. Prime Minister Mark Carney, still new in office and eager to prove alignment, mirrored the American policy: a 100% tariff on all Chinese EVs. There was no direct benefit to Canada. Few Chinese cars entered the country, and no automaker had asked for protection. But Ottawa took the step anyway, as a gesture of solidarity inside what Washington called the Fortress North America. Within weeks, Beijing retaliated. China's Ministry of Commerce imposed crushing counter-tariffs: 75.8% on raw canola, 100% on canola oil and meal, plus heavy duties on pork and seafood. For Western Canada, it was devastating. China had once purchased a quarter of all Canadian canola exports, a trade lifeline that kept the small towns alive. Now, the silos filled up and the shipping contracts stopped. Processing plants across Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta cut shifts. Farmers who had spent decades cultivating one of the world's most reliable crop markets were suddenly frozen out of their largest buyer, all because of a tariff on cars that most had never even seen on their roads. By late 2025, the picture was grim. Canola exports to China plunged 76%, collapsing to under $100 million. Pork producers in Manitoba lost $19 million annually. Local credit unions tightened lending as collateral prices fell. In town halls from Regina to Brandon, farmers asked the same question: why are we paying for Washington's fight with Beijing? Even as the pain deepened, Washington gave nothing back. The U.S. didn't compensate Canada, didn't open its market, and didn't protect Canadian suppliers from the tariff backlash. Instead, Trump's team began threatening Canadian auto exports, warning that if Ottawa even hinted at easing its EV tariffs, New duties could fall on Ontario-built parts and finished vehicles. It was déjà vu, a reminder of how dependent Canada's industrial policy had become on America's moods. In a single year, Ottawa had lost the freedom to set its own trade priorities, watching as China replaced Canadian imports with Brazilian soy and Argentinian oils, while U.S. automakers dictated Canada's foreign policy through the back door. Then came Beijing's counteroffer, direct, strategic, and elegantly simple. No long negotiations, no Phase 1 framework. Just one clause. Remove your EV tariffs and we will immediately lift ours on agriculture. For China, it was a geopolitical test disguised as economic generosity. For Canada, it was a chance at recovery, or a diplomatic trap. Because this time, the decision wouldn't just determine trade flows. It would reveal whether Canada could act as a sovereign economy, or whether it would continue acting as an annex of American policy. And as the numbers worsened, Ottawa realized something the U.S. still hadn't. In an age of multipolar trade, loyalty without leverage is just dependency with better branding. That realization set the stage for the quiet decision that would change North America's economic order. The moment Ottawa accepted Beijing's offer, the consequences spread like shockwaves through global markets. Silent at first, then unmistakable. What looked like a simple tariff adjustment quickly became a diplomatic earthquake that redrew lines of trust, power, and influence across North America, Asia, and beyond. China's strategy: soft power, hard results. For Beijing, the Golden Deal was more than an olive branch. It was a strategic masterpiece. After years of being portrayed as a global antagonist, China managed to shift the narrative with a single move: reward cooperation instead of confrontation. By erasing its tariffs on Canadian agriculture, China positioned itself as the pragmatic stabilizer in a world fractured by protectionism. It didn't threaten Canada, it enticed it. It didn't isolate Ottawa, it empowered it to act independently. That soft power play achieved three simultaneous goals: weaken Washington's grip over its closest ally, demonstrate credibility to other middle powers who might want to diversify trade beyond the U.S. dollar system, reframe China's image, not as a disruptor, but as a partner of opportunity. By the time Beijing's spokesperson confirmed the deal publicly, global media weren't describing China as the aggressor anymore. They were describing it as the deal-maker, Ottawa's quiet gamble. Inside Canada, Prime Minister Mark Carney's cabinet finalized the deal in a meeting that lasted less than 4 hours. The decision was sealed without fanfare, no press conference, no flag ceremony. It was a soft launch of a hard pivot. Within days, Chinese customs offices began clearing Canadian canola shipments again. Cargo trains rolled east across the prairies for the first time in nearly a year. Farmers in Saskatchewan and Manitoba flooded local radio shows in celebration. Rural economies that had been in recession for 18 months suddenly came back to life. By week's end, Chinese buyers placed orders worth $3.4 billion, and new contracts were being drafted to expand shipments of pork and seafood. For the first time since 2024, the word recovery replaced subsidy in Canada's agricultural headlines. But the real shock wasn't in Canada's fields, it was in Washington's boardrooms. The U.S. backlash. When news of the deal broke, the White House was blindsided. Officials confirmed that no advance notice had been given. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick called the move a violation of North American alignment, while Trump himself reportedly demanded immediate options for countermeasures. But there was little Washington could do. Under USMCA, Canada hadn't technically violated any clause. It was still trading within its rights, just not in ways that favored the U.S. anymore. On Wall Street, the reaction was swift. U.S. soybean futures fell as traders anticipated permanent Chinese preference for non-American suppliers. Canadian agri-stocks surged, with companies like Richardson International and Viterra hitting multi-year highs. The Brazilian real dipped slightly. reflecting fears that China might shift some import volume away from South America toward Canada. Meanwhile, in Midwestern America, the anger was palpable. Farmers who had supported Trump's tariff policies began questioning why Canada was winning from a war they were losing. In rural Iowa, one co-op leader told the Des Moines Register, "We played the long game for Washington. Canada just played the smart one. Europe and the global South take notes." From Berlin to New Delhi, the ripple effect was immediate. European policymakers, who had long feared being forced to pick sides, suddenly had a blueprint for balance. A model where a Western-aligned nation could still strike pragmatic deals with China without collapsing its alliances. For emerging economies in Africa and Latin America, Canada's decision looked like permission. Proof that small and mid-sized countries could act in their own interests without waiting for approval from Washington or Beijing. As one Singaporean analyst put it, "If Canada can do this and survive, every middle power just gained leverage." Beijing's global signal. The symbolism was unmistakable. For the first time in the modern trade era, a G7 nation, a founding NATO member and one of Washington's closest allies, had chosen to act independently of U.S. trade pressure. And Beijing wasted no time turning that moment into momentum. Chinese state media called it a victory for pragmatic diplomacy. A senior trade official went further, saying, "Partnerships are built on reciprocity, not rivalry." Across Asia, the message was clear. China can work with you if you're willing to think for yourself. The global chain reaction. Washington lost moral authority over its allies. Ottawa regained credibility as a mature economic actor. Beijing cemented its role as a global arbitrator, not just a competitor. And while the world debated what this meant for geopolitics, the markets had already decided. The center of gravity in global trade was moving, not westward, but across the Pacific. Because Canada's handshake with Beijing wasn't just about tariffs or canola. It was a signal that the post-American trade order had begun. When word of Canada's decision broke across Washington, it landed like a diplomatic thunderclap. Not because of the dollar amount, $5 billion in trade is pocket change on Capitol Hill, but because of what it symbolized. That a nation sitting inside America's own economic fortress had quietly unlocked the door and shaken hands with its rival. For the first time in decades, the United States watched its closest ally choose autonomy over allegiance. The shock in Washington. Within hours of the announcement, briefing rooms in the White House and the Commerce Department filled with disbelief. "How did this happen without us knowing?" one senior official was overheard asking. There was no leak, no prior warning, not even a diplomatic courtesy call. President Trump's advisors called it a breach of North American discipline. In private, the tone was harsher. They knew that Canada's move had cracked the image of unity the U.S. had built around its trade war. Now, every other partner, from South Korea to the EU, could point to Ottawa and say, "If they can trade with Beijing and stay in Washington's orbit, so can we." The White House scrambled for options. Some pushed for a new round of tariffs on Canadian exports, others for subtle regulatory retaliation, lengthier inspections at the border, delays on cross-border energy permits, revised safety certifications for Canadian auto parts. But there was a problem. Any heavy-handed punishment would only prove Beijing's point, that America was the bully and China the pragmatic alternative. The Midwest feels the burn. If Washington was humiliated politically, America's Farm Belt was devastated economically. The same day Canada reopened its export lanes to China, U.S. soybean futures slid nearly 7%. By mid-2025, Chinese orders for U.S. soybeans had already fallen to zero. Now, with Canadian canola and pork flowing back into Chinese markets, Beijing no longer needed American supply lines at all. The U.S. Department of Agriculture revised its forecast downward again. $9.4 billion in annual export losses. 12,000 jobs gone across Iowa, Illinois, and Nebraska. Small banks warning of a wave of farm foreclosures not seen since the 1980s. At co-ops and diners across the Midwest, the sentiment turned bitter. Farmers who had cheered Trump's tariffs as patriotic now saw Canada reaping the rewards of restraint. One Illinois producer told Reuters, "We fought the trade war, they sat it out, and somehow we're the ones losing the farm. Auto alley under pressure." In Michigan and Ohio, the story flipped. Executives from Ford and GM called emergency meetings with lawmakers, warning that Chinese EVs could soon reach North America through Canadian dealerships under USMCA's relaxed regional content rules. The irony was brutal. Washington's own trade pact made it possible for Chinese manufacturers to enter through Canada legally, while U.S. consumers were still paying tariffs. Industry analysts called it the EV backdoor. By mid-2026, Canadian dealerships were already fielding pre-orders for BYD and Geely models, sleek, affordable, and tariff-free. The same cars that Trump's tariffs had banned from U.S. showrooms were now being test-driven 20 miles north of Detroit. Wall Street's verdict. Markets saw what politicians wouldn't say aloud. America's economic grip was slipping. Canadian agribusiness stocks soared. The Canadian dollar strengthened to its highest level in 5 years. Meanwhile, U.S. EV and agri-export firms lost billions in market capitalization. Bloomberg's morning headline captured it bluntly. Ottawa outplays Washington. China finds a North American gateway. The political fallout. In Congress, tempers flared. Hawkish senators called for investigations into foreign interference and demanded hearings on why U.S. intelligence had missed signs of the deal. But behind the noise, a quieter realization set in. America's tariff diplomacy was collapsing under its own weight. By pushing allies to pick sides, Washington had forced them to notice something uncomfortable: that dependence on the U.S. came with more risk than reward. And now that perception was spreading. If Canada could defy Washington and still thrive, who might be next? Japan? Australia? Even parts of the European Union? The end of illusion. The Golden Deal didn't destroy the United States, but it did something far more profound. It ended the illusion that the U.S. could dictate the economic behavior of its allies indefinitely. Canada hadn't left the Western Alliance. It had simply grown up inside it, learning that in the 21st century economy, loyalty isn't measured by obedience, but by resilience. For Washington, the shock wasn't that China won a friend. It was that America finally lost the privilege of assumption. In every global power shift, there are winners who quietly rise, and those who don't realize they've lost until the dust settles. The Golden Deal was no exception. It didn't just redraw trade routes. It redrew the balance of trust, leverage, and reputation across the Western world. The winners: Canada's West and China's diplomacy. 1. Western Canada's rebirth. For the first time in 2 years, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta are hearing something they thought they'd lost forever: the sound of trains moving full grain cars eastward to port. Within weeks of the deal, prairie canola exports surged over 300%, reversing the catastrophic slump of 2025. Farmers who once survived on subsidies were suddenly hiring again. Local processors restarted shuttered facilities, and credit unions, once cautious, began extending new loans as commodity prices recovered. In Regina, one co-op manager told CBC, "We didn't just get our market back, we got our confidence back." For the agricultural heartland, the Golden Deal was a lifeline. Not just economic, but psychological. After decades of being overshadowed by Ontario's industrial might, the West finally proved its worth to the entire federation. 2. China's strategic patience pays off. Beijing played the long game, and won. By using incentives instead of intimidation, China flipped the narrative of power. Its message to the world was subtle but unmistakable. You don't have to choose sides, you just have to choose logic. Through one act of diplomacy, Beijing achieved 3 victories. It reopened access to clean, high-quality Canadian crops, easing its own food security pressures. It fractured Washington's aura of unity, showing that even the closest allies could act independently. And it proved that China could build alliances through trade, not threats. What made it genius wasn't aggression, it was restraint. Beijing understood that in a tired, tariff-scarred world, the most powerful weapon was stability. The cautious survivors, Ottawa and Europe. 3. Mark Carney's calculated risk. The deal could have ended Mark Carney's career. Instead, it may define it. By choosing a measured opening to Beijing, he balanced domestic politics on a knife's edge, reviving the West without collapsing Ontario's auto industry. Ottawa quietly attached phased import limits on Chinese EVs, delaying any direct competition until 2027. This gave Ontario's automakers time to adapt, while satisfying Western provinces desperate for relief. To the public, Carney called it a trade adjustment for a balanced century. To insiders, it was something bolder, a declaration that Canada would no longer trade its autonomy for alliance optics. 4. Europe's middle path. Across the Atlantic, Brussels was watching closely. The EU, caught between U.S. protectionism and Chinese expansion, quietly praised Canada's move as the most pragmatic act of diplomacy in years. Several EU trade envoys described the Golden Deal as a model for controlled cooperation, engaging with China where it benefits, resisting where it doesn't. For a continent desperate to maintain its independence from both Washington and Beijing, Ottawa had just shown the blueprint. The losers, the United States and Brazil. 5. The United States, from leader to laggard. No country fell harder in perception than the U.S. Washington's America First strategy was supposed to restore dominance. Instead, it triggered the first open defection of a G7 ally. The result was more than economic, it was psychological. For allies around the world, the myth of American indispensability cracked. U.S. farmers lost their biggest market. Auto giants faced new uncertainty, and the once solid North American alliance now looked more like a competitive neighborhood than a unified bloc. Even the Wall Street Journal wrote, "Canada didn't betray America, it simply stopped playing by America's rules." 6. Brazil's unintended setback. When the trade war began, Brazil emerged as China's new agricultural darling, filling the void left by North America. But with Canada's re-entry, Beijing now had leverage over Brazilian exporters. China could diversify its food supply, drive down soybean prices, and negotiate better terms with Latin producers. In short, Brazil lost its monopoly on Chinese demand, and with it, its strongest bargaining chip. The unexpected winner. Middle powers everywhere. The greatest beneficiary wasn't a country, but a concept: independence. From Australia to South Korea, from Chile to Norway, policymakers began rethinking how they negotiate with superpowers. The message was clear: you don't need to bow to Washington or Beijing. You just need to know when to pivot. And Canada had just shown the world how to do it, not by shouting, but by signing. The winners gained leverage, the losers lost illusions. But one question now loomed over the entire Western alliance. If even Canada, America's most loyal neighbor, can act alone, what does that say about the future of U.S. leadership? For Canada, the Golden Deal was not the end of a story. It was the opening chapter of a new global position. A single trade decision had redrawn its relationships with Washington, Beijing, and the wider world. The next steps will decide whether Ottawa's gamble becomes a model for resilience or a slow path toward isolation. Scenario 1. The balanced pivot. A dual-lane economy. In the best-case scenario, Canada successfully evolves into what economists are already calling a dual-lane economy. That means engaging with both superpowers, the U.S. and China, without being trapped by either. Here's what that could look like. Western provinces continue exporting agriculture and raw materials to China, stabilizing rural economies. Ontario and Quebec focus on high-tech manufacturing, AI, and green infrastructure closely linked to U.S. industries. Energy partnerships expand in both directions: LNG exports toward Asia, critical minerals toward America's EV supply chains. The result? a balanced, diversified economy that can weather shocks from either side of the Pacific. It would make Canada the bridge economy of the 21st century, the rare Western nation capable of trading freely across geopolitical lines. But balance is fragile. One policy misstep or a single shift in Washington's mood could turn opportunity into backlash. Scenario 2. The backlash. Washington strikes back. If the U.S. decides to retaliate, the consequences could be immediate. Washington has dozens of levers it can quietly pull. Delays at the border for Canadian goods under enhanced inspections. Technical trade restrictions on auto parts or energy exports. Reduced cooperation on defense contracts and intelligence sharing. It wouldn't take open sanctions, just small bureaucratic pressures to remind Ottawa where power still lies. If that happens, Canada's economy could feel a chill within months. The prairie boom might stall, while investors in Ontario's auto sector would hesitate, fearing U.S. political retaliation. This is the risk Carney's government knows well, that independence is never free. For every inch of sovereignty regained, there's always a cost in friction. Scenario 3. The North American rebuild, a realignment. There's another path, one few talk about but many quietly expect. The U.S. and Canada might redefine their alliance not by undoing the Golden Deal, but by accepting a new balance. In this model, Washington acknowledges what the world already sees, that a loyal ally can still be an independent one. The U.S. focuses on reshoring key industries, while Canada becomes a buffer economy, a stabilizer between Western and Eastern markets. Under this arrangement, both nations win. The U.S. maintains a friendly northern trade partner that keeps China's influence moderated. Canada maintains access to both markets without severing political ties to either. This isn't fantasy, it's pragmatism. It's the same logic that allowed Japan to rebuild after World War II, or Germany to thrive within NATO while trading with Russia and China for decades. If managed wisely, this could mark the beginning of a mature partnership across North America, one built not on dependency, but on mutual flexibility. Scenario 4. The Chinese integration. The quiet shift. There's also a more subtle possibility that the Golden Deal marks the start of China's economic integration into North America through the Canadian Gateway. Already, Beijing's state-owned enterprises have expressed interest in building EV assembly plants in Ontario and Quebec, funding research partnerships with Canadian universities on battery tech, purchasing long-term agricultural futures to stabilize food supplies. If these plans advance, Canada could become the first Western democracy to host Chinese-built EVs under a G7 regulatory framework, something unthinkable just 2 years ago. But this path carries long-term risk. Washington would view it as a direct encroachment on its sphere of influence. And history shows that the U.S. rarely tolerates rivals operating freely in its backyard. Scenario 5. The fragmented future. A continental divide. The darkest scenario is also the most realistic if tempers flare. The Golden Deal could widen existing fractures inside Canada itself, between East and West, urban and rural, industry and agriculture. Western provinces might start demanding more autonomy over foreign trade, arguing that Ottawa no longer represents their interests. That kind of internal division could reignite old debates about sovereignty and independence, the same ones that once gave rise to movements like Wexit. If that happens, Canada's success story could turn into its own internal test, not of diplomacy, but of unity. The crossroads of power. Each scenario leads to a different version of Canada. A bridge nation, connecting two worlds. A battleground, caught between them. Or a blueprint, showing how middle powers can rewrite their fate. But whichever path unfolds, one truth has already crystallized. The age of automatic alignment with Washington is over. The Golden Deal didn't just reopen a market. It reopened the question of what it means to be a sovereign nation in a divided world. When history looks back at this decade, the moment Canada accepted China's Golden Deal may not be remembered as a trade story, but as a turning point in the evolution of global power. It wasn't about canola or cars or tariffs. It was about sovereignty and the quiet courage to use it. The lesson for Canada. For decades, Canada's economic reflex has been instinctive. When Washington moves, Ottawa follows. It was a formula that seemed safe, predictable, profitable, and politically convenient. But as trade wars, tariffs, and power shifts rippled across the 2020s, safety began to look more like stagnation. The Golden Deal shattered that comfort zone. It forced Canada to answer a question it had avoided for generations. Are we a branch of someone else's policy or the authors of our own? By saying yes to Beijing's offer, Ottawa didn't abandon America. It simply refused to abandon itself. It was a decision rooted not in ideology, but in economic logic, and that made it revolutionary. The lesson for the United States. For Washington, this was the alarm bell no one wanted to hear. America's dominance wasn't destroyed by enemies, it was weakened by assumption. For too long, U.S. leaders believed loyalty was permanent, that allies would trade obedience for access. But the world has changed. The new global order isn't about who shouts the loudest. It's about who adapts fastest. While Washington tried to build walls, Beijing offered bridges, and one of those bridges now runs straight through Ottawa. The U.S. still has power, wealth, and innovation, but its influence depends on whether it can evolve from commanding to cooperating. If not, this Golden Deal will be remembered as the moment the American-led trade era began to fracture, one handshake at a time. The lesson for the world. Every middle power, from Australia to South Korea, from Germany to Chile, is watching this unfold with quiet fascination. Because Canada just proved something many suspected but few dared to test. You don't need to pick sides between giants. You just need to pick timing and courage. In a fractured global system, neutrality isn't weakness. It's leverage. And independence isn't rebellion. It's survival. The nations that will thrive in the next century won't be those who cling to alliances out of fear, but those who build new pathways out of necessity. Canada didn't break the rules. It simply stopped letting others write them. The symbolic shift. Picture it. Cargo trains rolling again across Saskatchewan's plains. Canola fields glowing gold at sunrise. Electric cars humming through Toronto's streets. And trade ships bearing both the Maple Leaf and the Five Stars docking in the same harbor. That's not betrayal. That's evolution. The quiet, steady pulse of a nation learning to breathe on its own. Final thought. The Golden Deal wasn't just a transaction. It was a test of whether middle powers can still make bold choices in a world defined by giants. Canada's answer was simple and historic. We'll work with anyone who respects our interests. In that single sentence lies the future of diplomacy. Pragmatic, balanced, and quietly powerful. Because the next stage of prosperity won't belong to the loudest empires. It will belong to the nations that master the art of saying yes to themselves before saying yes to anyone else.